Hi, how you going? So today we're going to talk about the manual mode. This mode is not as scary as you think it is. Basically everything that we've come up to, everything that we've learned in aperture priority and shutter priority and ISO, you all have to bring it all together now. And then in manual mode, you control all of those settings. So the first thing you got to do obviously is turn it in, put it into manual mode. So it's a little M button there, and now you control everything. There's no more automation in any of it. The only automation really is the metering, which is always happening anyway. So whatever the metering is showing, it'll tell you what exposure you've got, and then you adjust the shutter, the aperture, and the ISO. There's no auto ISO anymore when you're in manual mode. So you've always got to look at all three factors when you're taking the picture. So the main thing really is to get that exposure compensation symbol into the middle. If you can get it into the middle and balance up the darkness from the light, then you've got a fair enough exposure, and then you can adjust either side and get the perfect shot. So that's pretty much all manual mode is. It's just that with manual mode, you've got more control in certain situations, like when you're doing night photography or shooting the moon or things like that, where you you can't let, if you're in aperture priority and the shutter speed is way too fast, or whatever, and if you want full control, you use manual mode. It's pretty much just tweaking each of those three, ISO, shutter, and aperture, until you get the exposure. It's not that hard, really. I mean, the hardest part is you got to remember everything, and set it all up. And if you're in the middle of somewhere and you try something and you think, oh shit, my ISO was too high, or it was too, usually it's too low, because you usually you want to set your ISO around 200 for the perfect exposure, less noise, and then you start to realize, well, hang on, why is it so dark? Okay, so what I'm going to do is take some shots outside here in manual mode, and I'll show you all the different light variations that you can get. As you can see, depending on what kind of day it is and which way you're directing the camera, and if it's overcast or sunny. Today's overcast and it's raining, and you can see all the different light variations that happen no matter which way you're pointing the camera. There's always going to be a different light variations. Usually, I think they call that like dynamic range, and that's the hardest thing in photography for me anyway, because when I'm learning this is either the sky is overexposed like that, and then I'm underexposed, and then getting everything in perfect exposure. Jerry, you take a photo? Okay, so let's have a look at this scene here. So as you can see, the exposure meter there is flashing, so that means it's 3 stops or more underexposed. So in manual mode, what you can do is you first check what ISO you're in. So I always go here and you can change the ISO to whatever you want. I'll leave it at 200 for now. What I have to do now is I want to try and get that meter in the middle there. It's just like a signal. So the light coming in is like a signal. So what you've got to do is you've got to balance that light so it's properly exposed, and that meter down below there, the one that's flashing, that'll tell you whether it's exposed correctly or not. So the object is to try and get it in the middle. So obviously to the left is a little bit darker, to the right is brighter. In this instance, I want to get a nice blurry background, so I want to focus in on that bonsai there, and I want to get as much blurry background as I can, just for in this example. So let's just say I want to put it down to 1.8, and now you can still see that it's way overexposed. So if I take a photo, underexposed, sorry. So if I take a photo of that, you'll see in the photo it's way too dark. So what I need to do then is change the shutter speed to be less, and then as you can see, that meter is moving closer towards the center, and you'll get a good exposure right there. So at 160 and at f1.8 on an ISO of 200, I'll focus in there and take a shot. And if you have a look at that now, that's what you saw on the live view, so perfectly exposed. Alright, so for instance, let's try and get the background nice and focus. So let's pump it up a bit. Let's put it at f16. I know that that's going to make more depth of field there, so but once again, because I'm on ISO 200, I'll need to decrease the shutter speed. So here until once again we get that exposure in the middle there. Now if you want, so that's right in the middle. Now obviously, so we'll take a photo there, and that's at half a second. If let's go back, and if I want to go higher to f22, now I really need to drop it down now to like 1.3 of a second. So obviously now you're going to introduce camera shake. That's what you've got to compensate. Now if I don't have a tripod and my camera shake is too much and the image stabilization isn't helping, the other thing you could do is you could increase your ISO. So as you see, as I'm increasing the ISO, the sensor is becoming more sensitive to the light and it's making it brighter. Say I put it at ISO 1600. Alright, now I can increase the shutter speed to let less increase the shutter speed to let less light in, and you can see that that exposure meter is coming back to 0 there. If you want to go a little bit brighter, then you can go left or right there. You know, that's how you control the exposure compensation in manual mode, by using either the shutter, the ISO, or the aperture. So there's no exposure compensation like when you're in aperture priority. You are controlling the exposure compensation yourself using those three things. Okay, so one thing that I need to learn more about is the dynamic range. If you notice, I'll give you an example here. If I move into the metering mode, which is this one here, you'll see that ESP is the metering mode that takes a general overall reading of the entire scene, and what that does is it averages it out to give you a balanced exposure. But if I move it into spot metering, I'll show you, now only that center spot is actually reading the light. So if that's a perfect exposure there, but if I move it over and expose for the sky, you'll see that's getting too bright. The sky is obviously bright, and you'll notice that the tree and the wall is getting darker because you're exposing just for that little center bit in the middle. So then you've got to adjust for that. That's too bright, so I'll increase the shutter speed. Okay, there. Now the sky is exposed, but then the bloody tree is underexposed. So that's one thing. I think people take HDR photos, or they take two photos and they blend them together in Photoshop and stuff like that. But that's one thing to also look out for when you're in manual mode. You're always continually changing your aperture, shutter and ISO to get the correct exposure, but then certain parts of the exposure won't be exposed properly over or under. There's a thing called shadows. I'll show you that. Okay, in the info settings on your D menu, you go to live view info or the info, whichever one you're looking at through the eye view, and in custom 1 or custom 2 there's a thing called highlight and shadow. If you click on that, when you go back, okay, so you can see with the highlights and shadows, what's happened there is the background, let's focus on Jerry, the background there is I've got a let's get a perfect exposure there to 0, and now you can see in the background the sky is orange. That's highlights and shadows. So the highlights showing you that sky is too bright. Everything else in the shot's fine. There's no, and if it's blue, that means its areas are too dark. If you see blue flashing, it's too dark. But in this case, the light in the sky there is too bright. So now there's not much you can do there when you take a shot, because you can't turn the sky down to fit in. So that's when you need to do like the high dynamic range and take 2 shots and things like that. One way to think of photography is that it's all about light. If you take this analogy of a radio, the volume obviously is the shutter speed and the aperture, and the ISO is the sensitivity, like the amplifier of the sensor. So if you've got a weak signal, then you amplify it, but then you'll get more static and more noise in the signal. So you think of light, it's almost like radio signals, where the more light you get with the signal, and then you can fine-tune it to be in balance. So that's just a dumb analogy, but I was thinking about that yesterday.
It is racing with Noble Bell, the mare from Neewer. Jodhpur drifted back the fine cover. He's going a little.
So that's kind of like an analogy of you know, what a source of light or a source of radio coming in, and you're trying to boost it. And that's just one way to think of photography. Really is it's all about light, really. How much light is coming in and hitting that sensor, and you have full control over it using those 3 factors there. And then obviously you've got other factors as well to lessen the light and increase the light with flash and ND filters as well. So that's, you're balancing the light to get the perfect exposure. That's the dumb analogy, but it kind of makes sense. And I think I even read photo means light. So in like Latin or whatever, like photon torpedoes or something like that, you know, in Star Trek. So anyway, that's it for manual. Obviously there's more to it than what I've just explained. So the next bit I'll start getting into more of the manual. I think the next chapter is like HDR and things like that. And obviously I haven't gone through the settings inside. There's heaps of settings you can play around with. I'll read up more about that, and I'll see you next video.